Hey guys, it's Kayla back again with more Red Knot, and this time we have A Long Shadow by Charles Todd, an Inspector Ian Rutledge novel. Now, I don't know anything about this series, except for the little I've already looked at on the back. I think this takes place in England, so there might be some terminology that I don't know because it's based in England. Words are a little different, even though we both speak English. Also, this takes place in the early 1900s. I don't think I'm gonna be too lost because I like Sherlock Holmes, but we'll see. The cover isn't really much. It's from a white to a blue-gray. I think it's supposed to be the white part where the actual shadow isn't looks to me like it's covered in snow. And then where the shadow is showing the place without snow and a road that turns to the right. And then the shadow is coming in from the bottom left-hand corner up towards the right-hand corner, but only makes it to about the bottom 2/3 of the book before it stops, and it's just like a dude's shadow. I mean, nothing really overly detailed or special about this. It's kind of you could do a lot better. Author of A Cold Treachery and a False Mirror. Dark and Remarkable, Detroit Free Press. To the back, one of the best historical series being written today. Washington Post Book World. Scotland Yard's Inspector Ian Rutledge brought the Great War home with him. You mean World War I? And its horrors haunt him still. On New Year's Eve, 1919, he finds a brass cartridge casing, similar to countless others he'd seen on the battlefield, on the steps of a friend's house. Soon there are more purposely placed where he is sure to discover them. Mercifully, however, a case is drawing him away from London to a small Northamptonshire village where a local constable was shot with a bow and arrow in an allegedly spirit-infested wood. Here among the Tactum townsfolk, embroiled in a 3-year-old mystery of a vanished young girl, Rutledge hopes to keep his own ghosts at bay. But his stalker has followed him, and now an emotionally shattered policeman walking the razor's edge of sanity must somehow keep his balance long enough to discover who is tracking him, and why. Seamless in its storytelling and enthralling in its plotting, Todd's fine ear for dialogue and attention to detail shine in A Long Shadow. Fort Lauderdale Sun Sentinel. Am I saying that right? Sun Sentinel. I'm so stupid I cannot pronounce words. Chapter 1. Dunnington, 1919. Constable Hensley walked quietly through Thrift's Wood, looking left and right for some sign that others had been here before him, but the wet matted leaves showed him nothing, and the cold sun slanting through bare trees was more primitive than comforting. It would be dark soon enough. The light never lasted this time of year, unlike the glorious bright evenings of summer, when it's fucking hot as shit, when it seemed to linger as if unaware of dusk creeping toward it. And one particular summer evening, he came to the end of the wood and turned to retrace his steps to the small clearing where he'd left his bicycle. Halfway there, he could have sworn he heard someone moving beneath him, a soft step barely audible, but his ears were attuned to the slightest sound. Wheeling about, he scanned the trees around him, but there was no one to be seen through the tangle of undergrowth and trunks. No one living. Imagination, he told himself. Nerves. A small voice in his head countered, and he shivered in spite of himself. After a moment he went hurrying on, not looking back again until he retrieved his bicycle and mounted it. Then he scanned Thrift's Wood a final time, wondering how a place so small could appear so gloomy and somehow threatening even in winter. The Saxons, so it was said, had beheaded men here once, long ago, taking no prisoners, unwilling to be hindered by captives. They'd come only for booty and nothing else. Not slaves, not land or farms, just gold or silver or whatever else could be bartered at home. A greedy people, he thought, giving his bicycle a little push to start it forward. Greedy and bloody, by all accounts. But nearly 1,500 years later the name of the wood hadn't changed, and no one cared to set foot here after dark. He was glad to be out of it. Yet he could still feel someone watching him, someone on the edge of the wood, someone without substance or reality. Dead men, most likely, or the ghosts. One ghost. He didn't look again until he reached the main road. Out of the fields, away from the wood, he felt safer. Now he could pedal back the way he'd come, make the turning at the Oaks, and sweep down to Dulington. Anyone seeing him would think he'd been at the pub, or sent for from Leatherington. He'd been clever covering his tracks. It made sense to plan ahead and not go rushing about, if he had to go there. Of course, a really clever man, he told himself, would stay away altogether. The way behind him was still empty. That was a really short chapter. That was just 2 pages. Chapter 2. London, New Year's Eve, 1919. Francis was saying as their cab dropped them in Marlborough Square, "Marianne will be so happy to see you, it'll do her good." "Yes, well, don't expect me to play bridge," Rutledge answered her, half in jest, half in earnest. He had worked for the past hour to convince her that he was in good spirits. She had always been too quick to read shadows on his face. "You haven't forgotten the last time, have you? At the Moors? I was partnered by that awful woman. What was her name? Stillwell? She dissected every hand ad nauseam. Put me off bridge for the better part of a year." In the square behind them he heard the gate creak as someone came out of the garden and walked briskly away. The policeman in him noted the fact as the footfalls stopped, another gate down the street opened and shut, and there was silence once more. "You don't bring in the New Year playing bridge, silly. Besides, you ought to know how Marianne doesn't care for card games." "I don't know why I put a how in there, but I did," his sister informed him, walking up the steps to the door of number 18. She glanced up at him, thinking how handsome he was in his evening dress, his dark hair and dark eyes a sharp contrast with the gleaming white shirt-front. "How would you know what your sister thinks of you? Can you read her mind? Too bad she couldn't persuade him to wear it more often. ... For some reason. He'd become recluse since the war. Was Jean's shadow still hanging over him? Who's Jean? Maybe somebody from previous books. I don't know, but it would be nice to, have something filled in. Maybe this is from her perspective. I don't know. Or maybe this is omni-perspective, where it's everybody's perspective at once and not just one particular person. She didn't want to believe it was France, or shell shock lingering. Why the ellipses? He refused to talk about himself, however hard she probed, and Dr. Fleming was as tight-lipped as her brother. Marianne said something about an entertainment. Probably a new soprano. ... I'm getting sick of the ellipses. Mischief danced in her eyes as she waited for his reaction. Good God, that was at the Porters just before the war. She was Austrian and made the chandeliers quake. Now that's an outright lie, Ian. She was Italian. Francise's laugh was silvery in the cold air, her breath a frosty puff. She insisted you take her in to supper, and then spent the rest of the evening trying to persuade you to visit her in Venice. She lifted the knocker and then added, Jean was in a terrible huff. She was left with that colonel, the one with... The door opened and Marianne Browning enveloped Francis in a warm embrace. "Hello, my dear. I'm so glad you could come. And Ian, you've been a stranger far too long. Give your coats to Iris, here, and join us in the drawing-room." She swept them with her, made introductions, settled them with drinks, and sat down herself to resume a conversation about Canada, which their arrival had interrupted. Rutledge knew most of the people here. Simon, Marianne's brother, vicar at a country church in Sussex. What's a vicar? I don't know. Dr. Philip Gabbin, a Harley Street surgeon, and his wife, who had been friends with Marianne for years. A younger couple, the man missing in arm from the war, were Talbots, George and Sally. Rutledge had met them at one of his sister's parties. Across from him sat a naval officer, Commander Farham, and his wife Becky, who lived just down the road from Francis. The last guest was a dark-haired woman of infinite poise, whose eyes were turned on him as if she could read his thoughts. The intensity of her gaze made him uncomfortable. Her name was Miss Channing, and she was new to him. Marianne's husband, Peter Browning, had died in the influenza epidemic of 1918. A civil servant in the War Ministry, he had appeared well at 7 in the morning as he kissed his wife goodbye. At 3 o'clock he dropped dead at his desk, overwhelmed by a swift, massive infection. A silver frame on the mantel held his photograph, a thin-faced man with kind eyes. Rutledge had liked him immensely. The evening passed with pleasant conversation, and Rutledge found himself relaxing, the voice in his head silent for now, the company interesting enough to draw his attention away from his own thoughts. They had been bleak enough, lines from the letters lying on his desk still echoing in his mind. He was glad to escape them, if only for an hour or so. Mrs. Channing, sitting across the room from him, made no effort to charm her fellow guests, and yet she seemed to become the heart of the party, her voice never dominating, but often bringing laughter with a well-timed comment. He found himself wondering what her age was, closer to his than Francis's. Man, there's too many S's there, he decided, or perhaps younger than both of them. It was hard to tell, because she seldom spoke of herself, or of her late husband, as if too private a person to thrust her experiences on strangers. There were no benchmarks. What? You mean like things she would talk about that would show her age? Like talking about something that happened 30 years ago to hint at that I existed at least 30 years ago? Is that what that means? ... An attractive woman, most certainly, with what Francis would call good cheekbones, her dark hair touched with gold under the soft spill of light from the sconce behind her, her extraordinary poise intriguing, her laugh pleasing. Rutledge's deep dread of watching his soul stripped naked in public, the abiding fear of someone discovering the guilt he carried with him, the horrors of shell-shock, the voice of a dead man he heard as clearly as his own, faded. The policeman in him was lulled as well, and any misgivings he felt when introduced to her had vanished. In case you're wondering, shell-shock is what they used to call PTSD. All the same, he was glad to be seated down at the table from Miss Channing, his hostess on his right and Miss Talbot on his left. Dinner was nearly up to pre-war standards. It began with a consomme à la Celestine, followed by a roast loin of mutton with a pot of wine sauce, baked onions, potatoes à la duchesse, and spinach with savory eclairs or an apricot gâteau to end. I have no idea if I pronounced any of that correctly, but I tried. Marianne explained that her cook was a French refugee and a miracle worker, a widow who had charmed the butcher and the greengrocer into slavish devotion. It was not until they were settled comfortably again in the drawing-room, the tea-tray removed, and the hands of the great clock in the hall touching 11:25, that Marianne surprised everyone with the news that Meredith Channing could raise spirits. And I've asked her to conduct a séance to bring in the new year and the new decade. She ended, excitement beginning to flush her face. She's to discover if all of us will be wealthy and happy in 10 years' time. The women laughed, Marianne's enthusiasm contagious, but Farnham and Talbot exchanged glances and stirred uneasily, while Simon started to say something to his sister, and then held his tongue. And in the back of his mind, his dread lurching to life again, Rutledge heard Hamish exclaim, "No!" The single word seemed to fill Rutledge's head, and ricochet around the room, but no one turned to stare at him. No one else could hear it. He stepped back, shaken. As if she'd sensed the apprehension among her male guests, Mary Ann went on, "It's all in fun, of course. We did this on Boxing Day at the Montgomerys'. John raised Napoleon, of all people. The most outrageous thing happened, and we laughed ourselves silly. The other men made polite, if half-hearted noises, and moved reluctantly towards the table, leaving Rutledge stranded in the middle of the room. Miss Channing came to her hostess' aid, her eyes on Rutledge's face. I fear we have one too many, Mary Ann. I did say numbers mattered. Perhaps Mr. Rutledge would be content to watch rather than take part." "Well, at least somebody's aware that somebody doesn't feel well today." Mary Ann glanced at him in disappointment. "Oh, Ian, that would be no fun for you at all. I'll sit out instead. I don't want to give away any of the tricks, and I might, at the table." "No, Miss Channing is right," he said, his heart thudding in his chest at the thought of confronting his own ghost in public. It was all he could do to keep a rising panic out of his face. "I'm a policeman, after all, hardly susceptible to raising the dead, although Dr. Gavin and I might find the talent useful." He had managed to make light of it, and they laughed, although he felt anything but amusement. There were too many dead on his soul. It would do no good to raise them, if he couldn't offer them life again. "Well, assuming you believe this stuff, but hey." "And if by accident Miss Channing summoned Hamish—" "Who's Hamish? Is it this guy that you feel bad about? This Jean guy, I think is what his name was?" It was unthinkable. Panic was closer, the spacious room shrinking uncomfortably, until all he could see was Miss Channing's face, as if in a halo of brightness, her expression compassionate. Beside him, Frances placed a steadying hand on his arm. She was saying, "Ian's had a very tiring day. He's likely to raise the most boring spirits you can imagine. But I've always admired Sir Francis Drake, and I wouldn't mind asking him if he actually did bowl while waiting for the Armada." It was the first name that had come to her. She moved to the table and smiled up at Dr. Gavin. "Unless you prefer someone in the field of science." No, Drake will please me too," he answered, holding her chair. With a last apologetic glance at Rutledge, Mary Ann gathered her other guests. Then she added over her shoulder, "If you change your mind, Ian, I'll tell you." He answered, relief bottled up in fear for what was still to come. It was a farce, the séance craze, but it was sweeping England just now, and more than a few men of good repute had been gullible enough to comment publicly on the possibilities of reaching behind the veil of death. They dimmed the lamps with shawls, made up their table, and Miss Channing took her place at the head of it, asking everyone to clear their minds and join hands in silence. The ticking of the hall clock could be heard clearly, and to one side of the group Rutledge found himself gripping the arm of a chair. He uncurled his fingers and in defense tried to crowd his mind rather than empty it. After a moment her voice filled the room, low, melodious, almost mesmerizing. In spite of his fierce resistance, he could feel the peace that seemed to wrap him, and the security that it seemed to offer, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the voice as well, as if he thought she was aware of him sitting to one side, observing, outside the ring, disapproving. The skeleton at the feast. He shivered at the thought. "We are gathered here at the turn of the year, to call upon those wandering in the night, those with knowledge, those willing to come to our table and reach across the darkness that divides the living from the dead, and take my hand in friendship." He tried to think of an excuse to leave altogether, one that wouldn't embarrass Frances or cause comment. Because not liking the fact that a séance is going on would just be like, "I'm just going to step outside and let you guys have a thing, enjoy." I mean, I don't think that would embarrass your sister or upset people. I'm sure worse has happened. Instead, he was pinned to the chair, his mind frozen, unable to function, and he could hear Hamish calling this the devil's business, urging him over and over again to go, now. But there was no escape. Mrs. Farnham exclaimed anxiously. "I felt the table shift, and so you should, as the spirits surround us, taking their places beside us, looking over our shoulders. There is a little dog among them, a King Charles spaniel." Sally Talbot drew in a breath. "It couldn't be Jelly, could it? Oh, please tell me it's mine." Her husband said quickly, "Now, Sally." "Oh, but it would be lovely to know he's well and happy on the other side. You don't know how I've missed him." Miss Channing's voice rose above hers. "And behind him is the king himself. We welcome you, your majesty, and we ask you to tell us the name of the little dog that has so graciously announced your presence." The door behind them opened, and Iris whispered into the dimness, "Inspector, the yard is on the telephone." Did they have phones by that point? Gosh, I can't remember. I don't know. I assume so, since, it's in the book. He got to his feet with such haste he nearly knocked over the small table beside him. Gritting his teeth, he made his way quietly as he could out of the room. It was Sergeant Gibson on the line, wishing to confirm a detail in a case that had just been closed during the afternoon. Taking the upright chair in the stuffy little closet where the phone had been installed, Rutledge gave the sergeant the date he was after, and put up the receiver. For a moment he sat there, so relieved to be out of range of that compelling voice in the drawing-room that he could feel himself taking the first deep breath. It was as if he'd been granted a reprieve, and he intended to make the most of it. Stepping out into the hall, he turned to the housemaid and asked, "Will you summon a cab for Miss Rutledge when she's ready to leave, and tell her that I've been sent for by the yard?" "Indeed, sir, I will." Iris helped him into his coat, and he left, relishing the winter air, cool and cleansing, feeling as if he'd been miraculously spared an unspeakable ordeal. Overhead the stars seemed extraordinarily bright above the street lamps, and the noisy evening traffic on the road beyond the square had dwindled into an occasional motor car passing. "Bless Gibson," he thought, and Hamish echoed the sentiment, a dark growl that seemed to rumble in the space behind him. "So I guess he has an alternate personality or something floating around in the back of his head, and that's who this Hamish person is. And because all I do is, well, at the moment, so far, for like a couple of weeks now, is read Sherlock fanfic, all I keep thinking of is we're either talking about John Watson, or we're talking about the made-up fan character that is John's son." On the steps, he turned to look up at the drawing-room windows. Francis would give him hell for deserting her, but the Farnhams would be glad to see her safely home. There would be no need for the cab. No need of the cab. He tried to tell himself that Miss Channing possessed no strange or exotic powers, but he could still feel her eyes on him, and recall the way she had made certain he was not in the circle. "Well, as I said during the Kiki and Hana book, the first one, people have intuition, that you don't need to be psychic or whatever to be able to pick up on people's feelings. You just need to, as Sherlock would say, observe. Just have to pay attention. Some people find it easier to do than others, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just some people are more attuned to grasp that concept of people's emotions, feelings, things about them, than others are. Some do it legitimately, some do it fakely. There, I can say words. And regardless of what people can and can't do, some people just have an intensity about them that just makes you focus on them instead of others. It's called charisma. He went cold at the thought that she had somehow known his secrets, that she had seen into his mind and found the shadow of Hamish, and refused to make that knowledge public. But that was ridiculous. Walking home, he would clear his head of such nonsense. Flipping up his coat collar against the night air, he went down the pair of stone steps to the pavement. His shoe struck something that rolled, making a tinkling noise across the walk and into the gutter. His first reaction was surprise. It was a sound he knew. Moving to the curb, he bent down to search intently. Light spilling from the windows behind him picked out a metal cylinder a little distance away. He retrieved it, and recognized it even as his fingers reached for it. A .303 cartridge casing from a Maxim machine gun, its shape cool and familiar in his hand. There had been thousands of them on the battlefield, as common as the mud under a foot. But what was it doing here, on a quiet street in London? He stood up quickly, his gaze sweeping the fenced garden in the square, then scanning the street in both directions. There was no one in sight. Hamish said, "It's no here by chance." A sense of unease made Rutledge turn to look up at the house front. He could see the drawing-room, the curtains drawn, only a faint glow behind them from lamps shaded by shawls. The quiet, spellbinding voice of the woman conducting the séance seemed to echo in his head. The cartridge casing hadn't been there when he arrived at the Brownings. Well, how do you know this? You could have you could have missed it. I mean, I don't know anything about guns or bullets, so I don't know how actually big this thing is. It would have been dislodged then, as here Francis mounted the steps, and no one else had arrived after they were admitted to the house. Turning the casing in his gloved fingers, he could tell that it wasn't smooth. The lines were regular, as if something had been cut into the metal surface. Loops and swirls, not initials. Soldiers by the hundreds had done this sort of thing in the long watches of the night, or the deadly boredom of waiting for the next attack. In hospitals and convalescent homes, passing the time as they healed, men had been encouraged to make such things as boutonnières? I don't know what that is. Boutonnières. Vases, cigarette lighters, and even canes, out of empty cases of every size. Even copper diving bands from artillery shells and lumps of shrapnel had been turned into souvenirs, an exercise in patience. In the light from the nearest street lamp, Rutledge tried to judge what the design was. It was useless. He couldn't see anything but the glinting surface where the metal had been polished. Not that the design mattered. He was more interested in how such a thing came to be here, in front of the house where he'd been a guest. Hamish was saying, it doesn't signify. It fell from the pocket of someone passing by. I heard it fall, so would whoever was carrying it. Why not look for it? It wasn't a great value. Who could have known that I'd leave early? It could as well have been Dr. Gavin, he told himself, called to a deathbed. Or Miss Channing, séance over, leaving Marianne's guests to talk behind her back about the evening's entertainment. Well, why? I don't understand this sentence. So Hamish is saying it fell from somebody's pocket, and what's his face, our main dude, is saying, well, I heard it fall, so would whoever was carrying it, why not look for it? And then he says, well, they wouldn't look for it because it's not of great value. And that he's like, well, who would have known I would leave early and then leave it here for me to find? I'm not exactly sure this sentence structure, unless he's trying to rationalize that it wasn't here for him, it just happened to be there. I don't really understand. This is quite confusing. And he just said that it would have to have been somebody who wasn't a part of the guests in the house. So why would he rationalize that somebody in the party must have done it for him to find? But he just said that it couldn't have been because they were the last to arrive and they would have noticed it while they were going up to the house. Neither of them had been in the trenches. I wouldn't say much of it. It's out of place. That doesn't make it sinister. Yet, in a way it did. It was as if, in an unexpected fashion, the war had reached out to touch him again. Yon woman has unsettled you. Perhaps that was all it was. But the casing in his fingers was real. He hadn't imagined it. Where had it come from? Hamish was silent, offering no answers. After a moment Rutledge slipped the casing into his pocket. Then he turned away from the Browning house, and began the long walk home. Rather than settling his mind, the walk had given Rutledge too much time to dwell on other matters. The letters on his desk, one of them from his godfather, David Trevor, and that reminder of Scotland, of what had happened there months before, had stirred Hamish into grumbling activity. David had written in haste, "Young Ian has measles, and I've left him to Morga and Fiona. I'm banished to my club in Edinburgh, and thoroughly miserable at missing his first Christmas with us. Much as we've looked forward to your visit, the doctor advises no excitement. I promised the lad a pony if he stays in his darkened room without fuss. Why must it be dark? He has measles. I don't know anything about measles, but I don't think the darkness would help him. That's all I'm allowed to do. You might search out for a saddle and have it shipped north for Boxing Day if you like." It had been a visit intended to mend fences. Rutledge had last seen his godfather in September, just before Fiona and the child had come to stay with Trevor. He found it hard to face the young woman Hamish might have married. "So the dude's dead, but you have a little person in your head that's that dude. Okay. I think I figured this out earlier, but I forgot again. I'm kind of tired." Hamish might have married the woman whose name he'd spoken as he died. Harder still to greet her as a friend, when Rutledge knew himself to be responsible for Hamish McLeod's death. It was a shadow that lay heavily between them, even though he never confessed the truth to her. Yet he told himself, as he had left behind the snowy fells of Westmoreland barely 3 weeks ago, that perhaps the time had come to return to Scotland to face the tangle he'd made of his life, and find a little peace. It had seemed possible then. A fair-haired woman in a wheelchair had made anything seem possible, even confessing his nightmares to those who cared about him, clearing his conscience so that he could feel something again besides despair. But his good intentions had been swept away by another letter that had arrived, hard on the heels of the first. It had stripped away hope. Now he was glad not to travel north, glad to be spared what could have been a futile errand. He had convinced himself that love would make a difference. He'd have ended up making a great fool of himself instead. But such protests rang hollow in his ears, and all the while Hamish called him a coward. Even after Rutledge had retired, the soft Scots voice kept him awake, taunting and accusing by turns, breaking up memories, driving him like a spur. He lay there, counting the hours as the clock struck each in turn, his thoughts shifting from one unsettling image to the next, a narrow track of road twisting through the heavy drifts, a child's face, a woman standing in the cold snow, light of an open door, her hands on either side of the frame, and the room behind her dark as the grave. The sound of the weapon being fired, so loud as the confines of the kitchen that it seemed to ring in his head even now. Shifting again, he tried to find a more comfortable position, a drowsiness that might lead to sleep. Instead, he remembered Miss Channing's expression as she greeted him, only hours earlier. That fleeting party, a sense of understanding in her face, as if she read his thoughts, or had known him somewhere before. France? He stared at the barely visible walls of his bedroom. Why had she reminded him so strongly of the war and the trenches? Or was it only that bloody shell casing he'd never taken out of his coat pocket? By the time he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he began to dream of the war, so as he so often did, jerking awake as the whistle blew to send his men over the top. He could smell the trenches. He could smell the cornite, the sour sweat of fear that bathed his men even in the cold air. He could feel the rough wood of the ladder, the terror of anticipation, waiting for the soft thunk as a bullet hit its target and someone at his elbow went down. He could hear the yelling, the deafening sound of steady machine-gun fire as they walked out into the barren hell of no man's land, moving quickly toward the unseen enemy. Dash! And then he was truly awake, the noise and smells and drenching anguish of counting his dead fading into the darkness of the familiar room. His gaze fell on the second letter lying by his desk by the windows, the paper faintly white in the ambient light. He knew the words by heart now. Don't come back to Westmoreland. The desolation he felt when he first opened the single sheet swept him again. How do you learn to live again, he thought, where there is no hope, no warmth, no laughter? He lay there, trying not to think or dream or remember, until first light. Meredith Channing was also awake until dawn, her mind unwilling or unable to settle into peace. So that was Ian Rutledge, she thought, that tall, handsome, haunted man. Not at all what she expected. Mary Ann Browning had said, discussing her guests each in turn. He was in France for 4 years and doesn't often attend parties now. Such a shame. He and Peter were better at charades than any of us, and it was always great fun. But his sister has promised to persuade him. Was he severely wounded? She had asked. He was in hospital for several months. I'm not sure why. Francis never said, but nothing serious, apparently. He's returned to the yard. Of course the woman he was to marry broke off their engagement as soon as he came home, and wed someone else. That must have been a crushing blow. We were all so heartbroken for him, but I never liked Jean. I thought Jean was a dude. Or, well, whatever. I'm confused as to who's doing what and what character is what. I never liked Jean myself. I thought he could do much better. And then the first of her guests had arrived, and Mrs. Browning had gone to greet them. Miss Channing saw no reason to tell her hostess that she'd seen Ian Rutledge before, once, but only at a distance. She hadn't needed to include him in that silly business at the table to know his secrets. Ah, so she is a fraud. Okay. War, she thought, is such devastation for the living, for the dead, and for those who are not sure any longer where they fit in. But that brought her little comfort. There were some things that one couldn't explain away. Grace Lutteridge lay awake as well. The woman who cleaned for her on Tuesdays had told her she had seen Constable Hensley coming out of Thrift's Wood. I was taking the Christmas bells to the attic for the rector? I don't know what that is. The window was all dusty, and I took out my rag to clean away the worst of it, and I could see him hurrying away on that bicycle of his, for all the world like a haunted man. I can't for the life of me understand why he goes there. You'd think he'd stay away, like everyone else. She shook her head, considering the constable's foolishness. But then he's not one of us, is he? She added, else he'd know. A guilty conscience, Grace thought now. It makes people do foolish things, betray themselves even. She turned on her side, not wanting to think about Hensley or Emma. Emma was dead, and yet she might as well be alive. What was it the Romans believed? That a spirit wondered if the body wasn't given decent burial? Emma's wondered. Grace was certain of it, and it gave her no peace. Someone knew the secret of what had happened to Emma Mason, and Grace was convinced it was Hensley. Why else had he failed to find Emma's murderer? Maybe his life was threatened by the killer. Maybe he believes it was spirits, and he goes and tries to find her. I don't know. I also don't know why keep switching to all these different perspectives. Why not just stay to one? We can discover this shit as we progress. Chapter 3. Mid-January 1920. Rutledge stood on the cliffs above Beachy Head Light. Below him the grey waters of the Atlantic moved in angry swirls, crawling at the land. All around him the grass seemed to sway and dance, whispering in the echoes of the wind like disturbed voices. He had come here after a difficult 24 hours, forcing a would-be murderer to give himself up and release the hostages he had taken in a small cottage outside the village of Belton. The man, tired and unshaven, unrepented and silent, offered no explanation for stabbing his wife. He went with the constables without giving them any trouble, and the local man, Inspector Pearson, had said only, "I was convinced in the end he'd kill all his family. It's a miracle he didn't. In for a penny, in for a pound. We can only hang him once." He had nowhere to go, Rutledge pointed out, and whatever anger was driving him, it had finally burned away. He could still see the eyes of the man's mother-in-law staring at him in undisguised relief, something in her face that was old, as if 24 hours had aged her. Her daughter, trembling with exhaustion and pain, allowed the doctor to wrap her in a blanket and take her away in his carriage to his surgery. Blood had soaked through her dress, and her hands were clenched on the blanket's folds, as if to hide the sight. Her mother had followed in a second carriage with an elderly aunt, a thin, pale woman, who appeared to be in shock. Even the ex-soldier standing near the horses mirrored her numbness, his face turned away. As soon as the affair had been dealt with and he was free to go back to London, Rutledge had driven instead toward the sea, leaving his motor-car and then walking down to the cliffs. Beyond lay France. It was said during the war that the big guns could be heard here along England's coast, but they were mercifully silent now, had been for a year and 2 months. Looking back over the year, he could recognize his own long struggle to survive. The strain, the tension, the constant badgering of Hamish in the back of his mind had taken their toll. Jean's defection, the still unsettled business with his godfather in Scotland, and now the letter from Westmoreland. Had he really fallen in love here in the north, or had he been beguiled by those easy domestic moments in the kitchen when life had seemed so simple and comfortable? A lonely man could have mistaken such brief respites for feelings that weren't there on either side. He couldn't be sure any more, even though he'd gone over and over his own emotions. Elizabeth Fraser's letter had ended. "It is better for me to live as I am, where I am, than to imagine I could fit into any other world. I have a history in London. It would do no good to pretend I haven't, and I don't want to reawaken the memories there. They would be too painful. Don't come back to Westmoreland, Ian. I beg you. I am safer alone." He was too tired to try and work it out. As long as Hamish was there, in the shadows of his mind, he'd be mad to love anyone. It was reckless even to consider the possibility. He had nearly got Elizabeth killed, after all. He shuddered. What would he have done then? Mourn her as his lost love from guilt? He could hear Hamish's derisive laughter. A small stone dislodged by his shoe ran down to the cliff's edge and tumbled over, out into space. He watched it spin out, then disappear into the sea far below. It would be easy to step over the face of the cliff after that stone and end the struggle, end the uncertainty, silence the voice, crush the ghostly faces of men he had led and failed. It was tempting. It was in some ways the answer he had postponed in the hope that somehow he would heal. "It's no so simple. Hamish said. Leaping o'er the edge willna change the past, and it canna change what you are. Ye'll be dead, and so will I. Ye'll ha' killed me twice. That too will be on your soul. You are make-believe voices in the dude's head. You cannot technically die. Unless we're talking about penumbra, and then, well, you're entity into yourself. The voice was clearly Scots on the wind. What? Is that a phrase? What? I think he means he knows it's in his head, and it sounds Scottish because in his mind it's a person he once knew, but I've never heard that phrase. Coming from nowhere, and it was still. After a moment, without an answering, Rutledge turned back the way he'd come, to where the motor car was waiting. He had already turned the crank, heard the engine ticking over, and was climbing in, when something on the driver's seat caught his eye. It was another shell case. In fact, a pair of them, linked together in a short length of a machine gun's ammunition belt, collected and thrust there, because the casings were normally ejected from the weapon as it fired. I think what he means is that they're still jacketed, and so like somebody went snip snip to a clip and left them in his car seat. Okay, granted he's lost in thought, and we're not really sure like how far away from the car he was. I'm assuming a couple of feet, at least. Wouldn't he have heard something or noticed or anything? Like another car or somebody walking? That seems a little far-fetched that somebody could do this and not have him notice. He picked up the pair and stared at them, the same size and caliber of the one he'd found in London, and this time he was in no doubt. They'd been left where he alone would find them. There was a pattern around the metal perimeter of one casing, and he turned it around to examine it in the pale light of the winter afternoon. An odd pattern, a delicate staircase of poppies that curled around the brass surface. But where there should have been blossoms, there were tiny skulls with hollow eyes staring up at him. Death's heads, Hamish said. A warning. So what? Machine gun bullets have a language unto themselves like flowers? The same thought had crossed his own mind, but why on only one of them? Rutledge asked, curious, still examining the workmanship. Maybe he thinks ye ken why. Well enough. What? Ye ken why? I'm guessing you know why. After a moment he added, there was a private soldier in one of the companies down the line. I didna know him well. Ye ken... I'm guessing that's you know. Ken is know. But his sergeant found one of his carvings with a death's head on it, and the next time o'er the top, the sergeant died of a bullet in his back. Rutledge had never re-examined the single casing he'd found outside Mary Ann Browning's house. He'd been far more interested in why it was on her doorstep than in what was cut into its surface. As far as he knew, it was still in his dress-coat pocket. He looked around the headland, tasting the salt on his lips as the wind turned and blew off the sea. There was no one else out here, no one at all, that you noticed. Yet the cartridge casing hadn't been in the seat when he left the motor car. No shit. To walk out to the cliff's edge, that was a certainty. Obviously. If anyone had followed him here from the village, where was he now? That's what I was asking several minutes ago. Lying flat somewhere in the scrubby grass, or long since gone on his bicycle, making a silent retreat. Assuming he was on a bicycle, you didn't hear anything. You were busy staring out the sea, contemplating your death or some shit. Turning slowly in a circle, Rutledge scanned the landscape once more, as far as he could see. The emptiness around him seemed filled with something malevolent. He couldn't shake off the sense of being watched, but there was not even a gull in the sky overhead. That you can tell. I don't know if there's trees or anything that would really hide somebody, but it's possible. There hadn't been anyone in the square in London either. After a moment or two, Rutledge tossed the casings into the passenger seat and put the car in gear. All the way to London, he reminded himself that while someone might have known he was going to the Brownings' party, Sergeant Gibson had tracked him down, after all. No one could have guessed that he would drive out to this God-forsaken headland late on a cold and windy January afternoon. He himself hadn't expected to come here. It had happened on the spur of the moment, a whim dictated by a need for silence and peace. Someone would have to be a mind-reader, ellipses. He was nearly certain that there was no reason for anyone to follow him from the village where the hostages had been taken. It was far more likely that someone had tracked him down from London, but why? I'll keep reading it. I think it's interesting enough to continue reading. I really don't understand why we had to switch to so many different perspectives, and sometimes it was confusing as to which variation of third person we're supposed to be in. Are we strictly following Rutledge, or are we following everybody who happens to be in that scene? Because when you have different perspectives, especially with third-person perspective, you really need to make it clear who's thinking what and who's doing what and who knows what. And this can be accomplished in a bunch of different ways. One way is to make it strictly a single person, third person. There's character voice versus reader voice. And character voice will either be third person or first person. Reader voice will basically be, what character are we following and who's saying what and how are they saying it. Like, you could write a story from just Rutledge's point of view. So we are entirely privy to his thoughts, his opinions of things, what he says, who he interacts with, but we're not privy to the other person's, anybody else's opinion. So if Rutledge is talking to his sister, we would never know what she's thinking unless she decides to voice it. And then again, we wouldn't know if she's telling the truth or not. We just have to assume it's so. And, of course, Rutledge wouldn't know anything more than he finds out, regardless of anything else going on in the story. However, as the reader and having the reader's voice, the reader can be privy to information that some characters don't have. So, for example, if we wanted to say that Rutledge and his sister are two main characters, we could go back and forth between their perspectives, and things that she learned about the situation wouldn't be necessarily what he'd learn about the situation until much later, or possibly never. It depends. And that's also sticking to one specific perspective per character. You could change it up with what they would call omni-person perspective, which is specific for third person. It's where all the characters involved, you know what they're thinking, you know what they're doing, and you know probably who the bad guy is. I mean, the author will probably pick who you know and follow, but you can be privy to everybody's thoughts in omnipresent third person, which is what was going on in chapter 1, where the sister is talking to Rutledge, and there's just that little aside. She thought he looked really nice dressed like this, and she wished he dressed like this more often, instead of being, just becoming a hermit and wanting to stay by himself all the time. that was suddenly omniscient perspective. Because there's no way Rutledge would know what his sister's thinking, and she wouldn't know what he's thinking. They are not psychic. They can't read each other's minds. But that's also why it makes it so strange that we suddenly got her perspective, because what I've read so far, it's pretty much just Rutledge's perspective. But then we randomly switch to all these other different people's perspectives, and that's really, really difficult to follow. Too many characters just kind of tossed in there with short little paragraphs. And as a reader, I'm expected to remember all of this shit. And it's too much. You can introduce more characters after chapter 2. You know, you're not limited to introducing characters by chapter 3. You can introduce characters after that. It's just if you're writing mystery, the standard rule is you have at least introduced the villain. Even though we don't know who the reader wouldn't know who the villain is yet, we'd at least introduce the villain by the end of chapter 3. That doesn't mean you can't introduce other characters, or that other people come into play later in the book. It's just that it should happen naturally. And that if you have to bring this character up, then, okay, you can do that. Just make sure that it's relevant, it's natural, and it makes sense for later in the book when they show up again. Because if you have somebody show up in the book, they really should kind of come back into play, even if we haven't seen them for a while. So, some of these characters, like when we switched to Grace, that's what her name was, I couldn't remember. Why do we have to have this little insert about Grace and this character Emma, who I assume is, the person we're going to try to, obviously figure out who murdered her and all that as the book goes on. But again, you don't have to shove everybody in to the first 3 chapters. It's just really you have to introduce the villain by the end of chapter 3. Again, it's not really a hard and fast rule. That's just what I was taught. And honestly, you could bring this Grace Letteridge person into the story by the time Rutledge gets to the place to start his investigation. Because obviously he's going to want to talk to the people who were close to the girl and who initially investigated when she went missing. That's what I would change with that. Also, I would decide which character voice and which reader voice I'm going with, because reader voice is not it's not important, but it's also not as important as establishing character voice, because the reader is following the character. And if at any time you switch characters, it needs to be clear, and you need to keep in mind what one character knows versus what another character knows. Because people are not going to know that, spoilers for Resident Evil fans, Barry Burton is tricked by Wesker, who threatened the life of his family. And then comes to find out that Wesker lied about that. Nobody who cares about Barry's family, he just said that to get Barry to work with him. Well, how in the hell was anybody, including Barry, supposed to know that shit? That's the thing, you weren't until it was revealed. And then you're like, oh, well, I understand why Barry's doing this suspicious shit now. So the last thing I can think to talk about is that when you have a conversation with characters, between 2 characters or more, you need to make it make sense to the reader. It's alright to have, say, in the case of Rutledge, who is a character with another personality in his head, it would be okay to have that character be privy to Rutledge's thoughts. That they're easily on the same page because they know what the other one's thinking. Or I'm assuming this considering that one bit that Hamish was talking about. Now, the problem with that becomes you have to actually explain what's going on, and you still have to do the dialogue in a manner that makes sense so that the reader can follow along. If at any time I have to stop and go, what? That's not a good thing. That means I have to stop and think and guess at what you're trying to tell me. And if I have to do that, you need to go back and rewrite that part. And it could be the whole paragraph, it could just be a sentence, it could be a whole chapter. If I don't understand what's going on, you gotta fix it. Again, this is where betas and a second pair of eyes comes in to help you out. Lastly, on accents, it was totally cool to have characters with accents. It's just, even if somebody's familiar with that accent, for example, I'm Southern, so sometimes I say words that people are like, you're not saying it right, and I'm like, I have a dialect. I speak the local dialect, so just because it doesn't sound right to you doesn't mean it's not right. I say whoosh, I say ain't, I say reckon, and over there, and yonder, and all that crap. I say that. Sometimes, I'm sure when you listen to some of the videos, you can hear me sound very, very Southern. And then sometimes I don't. That's not something I can help because I grew up with that kind of language. It's just a part of me, and so if I was a book character, Southern is how I would sometimes talk. Every sentence or thought I had would be sprinkled with Southern phrases, or Southern ways to pronounce things. One of those things that you'll see often in books is when you're dealing with a Southern character, they'll just drop their G's and put like a little mark there to dictate that, yes, we know the G is missing, we meant to do that. So like, I'm going to the store instead of I'm going to the store. Southerners just do that. They just drop G's left and right. And that's how you would put it in a book. You can also do other little things, like maybe some older things, like we refer to overalls as ha-has. Not so much anymore, but that's more like a family thing, because my youngest uncle on my mother's side called overalls ha-has. So that's not necessarily a Southern thing. That's more of a in-joke for the family. My grandmother, I called her Mamaw, because, I was confused between Mama and I guess they were trying to get me to say Mamaw, or Mamaw, but it became Mamaw. And so everybody called her Mamaw, because I did that. You could even have things like that, which not only give your characters nice little sayings, that seem natural, because every family is going to have things that they call something because of somebody saying something dumb once. Because they were young and didn't know, or because they were being silly and it was funny at the time, so they just kept referring to that thing as a thing. Like we do on the show, run them around like pigs, what the hell are you doing, motherfuckers? Things like that are just neat, interesting ways to spice up a character's dialogue. But if you really want to go with accents, I'll tell you what I was taught. You change one, maybe two things. Basically give a Southern character a quirk. As in, every time they do an ing word, they just automatically drop the G. And they never say the G in their written dialogue or in their monologuing thoughts. And then maybe something else, like they'll say ain't every once in a while, or y'all, or something like that. You don't want to have every other word in some strange accent thingamabobber, because it will confuse the brain. I tried. I really did. Because, I'm Southern, so I'm like, I know Southern words. And I picked up Mark Twain. And I think this was The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. This was like 5th grade. And I whipped it open, and I'm like, I'm gonna read this, because I'm Southern, and I like the story from, shows I've seen on TV, so I'll actually read the book. I did it, but it was very hard. I struggled with each and every page, and the only way I could read that book was speaking out loud and guesstimating what was supposed to be said, because he wrote as if he was speaking the dialect. And let me tell you, that is very, very difficult to read. And that's my problem with what is supposed to be Scottish, I'm assuming, in this book. I can understand some of it, but then I have to guess at other things. That's not really okay. I mean, there have been horrible bad fanfics that have gotten the idea of a Scottish accent down better than a published book. I don't know. But those are some things I would keep in mind if you're trying to do things like that. My final thoughts are, I'll keep reading. I don't see why I should not keep reading. I'm worried about some of the things that come up, but maybe it'll be okay. I don't know. And I'll see where the book goes. I'm Caleb, and this has been Read Not. Thank you for listening. Bye!